Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and on the occasion of Austria's National Day on October 26, also known as Austria's Day of Neutrality, I'm joined by two wonderful Austrian academics. Michael Gehler is professor for history and the head of the Institute for History at the University of Hildesheim. He has published well more than 300 individual commentaries, articles, and books, one of them being the 2007 German language work Model Case for Germany, the Austrian Solution of a State Treaty with Neutrality, 1945 to 55, in which he analyzes on 1,400 pages Germany's lost chance to reunite in the 50s by way of a neutral solution, the very same way that Austria regained its independence and retained unity through its neutrality. Secondly, I'm also joined by my colleague and friend Heinz Gärtner, an emeritus professor at the University of Vienna, a pro-peace and pro-neutrality activist who has also written many books, great amounts of them, and he's a frequent guest on this show, so I know you know him from before. Michael and Heinz, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hello,
thank you for
Pascal.
the invitation. It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Well, to both of you, we want to discuss today neutrality in Europe and the lessons from the Cold War of that. Michael, you researched various neutral states and initiatives for neutral solutions in Europe. Most importantly, of course, a difference between Austria and Germany, which both had a Soviet offer for a neutral solution on the table back in 53, 54, 55. One took the offer, Austria, and became neutral and remained united, and the other one didn't, divided and went through the Cold War as we know it. What does that episode teach us about neutrality during the Cold War?
Yes, let me first say that the title of this mentioned book, Model Case for Germany, there was a question mark behind that title. That would say that both cases were different, but they could have been treated in similar ways. This is one of the outcomes of that book. To give an answer to your question, I think neutrality was a means for Austria to preserve its territorial integrity, to also secure its borders, and what was more important, to gain state independence, sovereignty, and to get the Russian troops out. The Federal Republic of Germany rejected neutrality, and also the pledge made in coordination with the Western powers to the Soviet Union as Austria had done it. So the accepted consequence of this decision to reject neutrality was the division of Germany. So for Austria, there was unity, national unity, let's say, with freedom through state treaty and a self-declared permanent neutrality. And the country, what is also important, was and remained more or less Western-oriented. Concerning the FRG, the Federal Republic of Germany, the rejection of neutrality ultimately meant only partial freedom from the Western side, for West Germany, without the whole German unification, without, let's say, sovereignty and independence. And while the GDR, East Germany, remained completely outside, and the East Germans were left behind the Iron Curtain, so the Germany's division, I think, was the price for the German rejection of neutrality. To make a long story short.
Heinz, how do you view this episode?
2 points. One, before Austria adopted the neutrality in 55, so it was not necessarily that it was at that time a Soviet offer, because the Soviets stopped to ask for neutrality in late 54, because they said until the German militarism is not solved, there cannot be neutrality. And there have been two factions in Moscow, the Molotov-Suslov and the Kaganovich section and the Khrushchev-Malenko section. And Molotov was against it. And the Austrian Chancellor Raab negotiated with the Khrushchev faction. And then the Soviets accepted Austria's bid for Austria's proposal for neutrality. So it was more an Austrian request than a Soviet offer. Then after 55, the German question, of course, I have to, there has been several attempts, so let alone the Stalin note of 55, several attempts by Western pundits and experts and diplomats to look at Austria and suggest that there should be a neutral Central Europe, including Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, because 10 years after the Second World War, Austria got its sovereignty and territorial integrity with neutrality back, and Germany still was divided. So no German unification in sight. So there have been suggestions by George Kennan, for example, or by a bipartisan initiative in the American Senate, Nolan Humphrey, also the leader of the British Labour Party, Hugh Gaitskell, they all suggested the same, had similar ideas, like a neutral Central Europe, a unification of Germany. On top of that, there was in 57 the Rapatsky plan, who asked for disengagement zones, which basically means a neutral zone with a nuclear weapon-free zone as well. Also, Austria was a model because in Austrian state treaty, Austria was prohibited to get nuclear weapons. So Austria was already a nuclear weapon-free state. So it didn't work out because of the Cold War. And actually, I have to say, US President Eisenhower supported Austria's neutrality. Of course, there was a division between his foreign minister, John Foster Dulles, who was more on the Adenauer side, who rejected neutrality. But Eisenhower supported it. And let me just finish with one anecdote. In 56, when there was an Hungarian uprising, and the Soviets suspected Austria to host Hungarian insurgents and threatened Austria. And Eisenhower would say that foreign ministry at that time would say, if Austria's neutrality is violated, that would lead to a Third World War. Strong words, but it means that neutrality, if respected, can be a very good security guarantee.
You know, this is really interesting, because one of the reasons why the Germans declined this idea of neutrality, which for the Germans actually came from the Russians. I mean, even Stalin, when he was still alive, kind of offered this, right? And there were cartoons about, oh no, this is just a ploy. Michael, there are historians, Austrian historians, most importantly our colleague Peter Ruckenthaler, who strongly claim that, look, this was never meant serious. Like, neutrality for Germany never was meant seriously by the Soviets. And the arguments that he brings out is that there's no archival record in Moscow that would prove that the Soviets seriously prepared for for a German reunification and neutralization. So it was always just a ploy or a political talking point. But you see it differently, don't you?
Yes, I see it very differently, because we have, first of all, to differentiate between the different notes which were published by the Soviets. So the first was on the 10th of March, 52. The second one was then on the 9th of April. And then the following two notes were not really so much substantial than the first ones.
At the notes, sorry, just to interject, the notes are the offers from the Soviets, who wrote, yes, like, how about you become neutral? Mm-hmm.
We have to look very carefully to the content of both of these notes. 10th of March, 52, and the second one, the 9th of April, 52. And if you look to the content, what was the main goal? The main goal was the conclusion of a German peace treaty. And this was in the core interest by the Soviet Union. And they offered in this note, the Soviets offered in this note, not only to negotiate on a German peace treaty on a 4-power level, they also said, it should be possible that the future unified Germany should be not part of any coalition. Neutralization was never mentioned in these texts, and also not neutrality, but Koalitionsfreiheit in German, so free of alliances. That's a very important point. And secondly or thirdly, they also offered a German national army. So it was clear that Germany should be then in a position to defend her position, future unified Germany, as a let's say non-aligned, alliance-free country. In the second offer, Stalin also proposed free elections for whole Germany. And you can say, well, all this stuff was propaganda, but I think it's too simple. It's too simple. The main important point is that Adenauer and also the Western powers feared that these offers are so serious, but also so dangerous for their concept to integrate Western Germany into the Western system, that they feared that really the Soviets meant these offers very, very serious, and that's why they feared that they would lose their positions in West Germany. And concerning Peter Ruggenthaler's book, I cannot see any real proof related to Stalin that this was only a bluff. And if you look to Soviet interests, they always came back to the Potsdam Agreement in the late 40s and the very beginnings and till the mids of the 50s. And also later on, they referred to Potsdam, four-power solution for Germany, getting also access to the German economic potential concerning the Ruhr territory. So it was in the interest of the Soviet Union and the leadership to prevent a strong anti-communist, anti-Soviet bulwark through West Germany. And I think the better solution was a unified, alliance-free Germany. If you look to an internal report by the Secret Service of the State Department from July 55, you can find out a very interesting thing, because Heinz mentioned before an anecdote. This is more than an anecdote. It's very interesting what the internal assessment brought out on the question of a neutralized, neutral Germany. I can quote that. It's after the FRG followed a joint NATO. I can quote, a neutralization or neutrality of Germany was neither ruled out nor considered impossible by the Secret Service of the State Department. And according to this internal assessment, no communist, no pro-Soviet Germany was expected in case of alliance-free or neutral Germany. On the contrary, even if the Soviet Union had lured with German eastern territories beyond the Oder-Neisse line, Germany would not have crossed over into the Soviet orbit, but would have resisted it and secretly cooperated with NATO and remained pro-Western. So much just for an internal assessment that was not intended for the German public. So the examples of Austria and also Finland prove this assumption. They were and remained Western oriented, and they did not become communist. So from a rational case analysis, I think the first and the second offer, 52, Stalin notes, were meant seriously. But there were many options. I think it was a case, a test, and a document for all options. If the West would reject that, then the Soviet Union could also argue, well, that's your problem. You were not ready to negotiate, but the main topic was, and the main goal was, to get a German peace treaty. And Koalitionsfreiheit was one of the means, national army was one of the means to get a German peace treaty. That was in main interest of Germany, and I think this point is neglected by Peter Ruggenthaler.
I think so too. So, and Heinz, I suppose you agree with this, that there was a real chance there, wasn't it? Wasn't it when the Soviets offered it again and again?
I think Adenauer opposed it from the beginning. So he put Western integration before any unification or even neutrality. So I did not see any chance that Adenauer would have accepted neutrality, let alone what the Soviets and what Stalin were thinking. And also Austria's situation was, I think Austria could not have become neutral as long as Stalin was alive, but still Austria's neutrality was very much linked to the German question, also from the Soviet perspective. And it's not accident that Austria could only officially get the state treaty and adopt the neutrality after the decision has been made that Germany would join NATO, Germany without Austria. So it was already Paris agreements in late 1954 when the decision was made, and Germany was NATO member, became NATO member, and Austria then the Austrian situation was delinked from Germany. But Adenauer always said neutrality is a Soviet poison. It's a Soviet poison, and of course he was wrong. Looking at Austria and looking at Finland, as Michael mentioned, he was wrong. So neither Austria nor Finland became a part of the communist system, but there was a danger for Austria to remain divided. So there is no doubt about this, because in 1946, when Churchill gave his speech in Fulton, he said, the future Europe, the map of future Europe would look like Berlin, and Vienna would be part of the Eastern Bloc. So that means Vienna and Berlin, Eastern Bloc, and Germany and Austria divided. That was the idea behind it. And the final point, Austria was also a model, because Michael mentioned Finland, for Finland, because Finland had this friendship treaty with the Soviet Union in 1948, and there was a real possibility, different to Austria, that Finland would be integrated in the Warsaw Pact Treaty, because the Soviet Union had other friendship treaties with Romania, Bulgaria, and Finland always said we don't want to keep out of the great power competition, but not until Austria became neutral. Finland dared to use the word neutrality, and ever since the Finns would say neutral, and meant get more independence from the Soviet Union. And the Soviets always said friendship treaty, more consultation, and the Finns would say neutrality. And the Soviets got annoyed, and after 1968, after the Soviet invasion in Czechoslovakia, the Soviet Union deleted the word neutrality from all bilateral treaties between the Soviet Union and Finland, what changed after Gorbachev. So Finland's neutrality was successful not to get integrated into the Warsaw Pact. The opposite what Adenauer suspected, and the same is true for Austria.
Neutrality is always...
I would like to underline the position pointed out by Heinz. I think Adenauer was the key figure when rejecting this offer. And it's interesting to see that a few days after the first offer came out by Stalin, Paul Nitze from the State Department, from the German desk, said we should be prepared in case if Adenauer is willing to negotiate. And the Americans prepared just a date in 1952 for all German free elections. And McCloy talked to Adenauer and said, what shall we do? And Adenauer said, we should continue with our policy of Western integration. If you look to the memoirs written by Adenauer, the other way around was said by him. He had asked McCloy, what shall we do? And McCloy should have said, we will continue with our policy. It was the opposite. Adenauer took the decision. And very interesting, in April, Dean Acheson, Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, said, well, now we know the position of Adenauer. We should now try to negotiate with Stalin just for having a showdown and just to see that he is bluffing. And then Adenauer was always very furious and said, no debate, no negotiations, because in the end, Adenauer meant this really serious. So very interesting. Adenauer was the key decision maker, sorry. And I think that's one of the main points of that discussion.
Let me add a little story about that. Adenauer was such a staunch defender of Western integration, and
Yes.
Sent a message to the Americans, and the Americans still talked until 56, 57 about unification. But there was a secret document at the National Security Council in the US in 58, and they said, all right, Germany does not really want unification, so we have to stop to go forward with this idea. We talk on a general level about unification, but not on a policy level. And that's the quote, in order to keep the Germans happy. So they put off unification for very, very long time, because they knew Adenauer would not want it anyway.
Okay, and I will skip now one of the questions that I sent you previously. Let me go straight into my third point that I want to discuss with both of you, which is that the historical example of the neutrality discussion about Germany shows to me that, well, politics and political moments are very contingent upon like different factors and like different stars aligning. So in a sense, for Austria, the stars aligned to become neutral and stay unified, and for Germany it didn't, mainly because the little star Adenauer didn't want to play ball with that possibility, didn't go down that route. Do you too see parallels between that history of Germany and Europe, how it developed, and today? I mean, to me, the parallels with Ukraine are actually quite strong, but maybe I'm overinterpreting this. Michael, do you see parallels between the Cold War and what happened to Germany and today?
Yes, I think historical comparisons are always useful and leading to further knowledge, but also the differences had to be taken into account. I think it's a comparable constellation with differences. In the East-West confrontation, we had the non-aligned and neutral states. Actually, in the multipolar constellation, we have new non-aligned and neutral states. If you look to the attitude by Brazil, by India and South Africa towards the issue of the Russian war against the Ukraine. So it's interesting that they are not really condemning Putin's war of aggression. Sometimes they also blame Zelensky, that he has also a kind of responsibility for this war. So I think in this big confrontation between the European Union and the United States, on the one hand, against the People's Republic of China and the Russian Federation, if you take Brazil, if you take India, and you take also South Africa, they are undecided. They take a kind of non-aligned neutral position. And what Brazil and India are doing, I think Switzerland and Austria can also do this if they want it. So I think neutrals also of today don't need to add further fuel to the confrontation, which has already largely escalated, actually, because we are on the brink of a war with nuclear weapons. I think the situation of today is much more difficult, complex, and dangerous than the Cold War, the old Cold War we had from 45, 47 to 89, 91. And this is being waged at the expense of Europe. And the question is, what is the position of Europe? What is the position of Germany? Do we have a strategy beyond the American strategy, which obviously tries to weaken Russia or to make Russia not more aggressive than in the case of Ukraine? So what is the European position? And I think the neutrals are the remaining neutrals, we have to say, because Finland joined NATO and Sweden will do that, I think, very soon. Depends also only on the Hungarian green light of the Hungarian parliament, because Turkey and Erdogan just gave the green light. So what did Switzerland and Austria? 3 things: reducing the energy supply from Russia. Second, also participating in the sanctions against Putin's systems and structures. And third, providing humanitarian aid. And all these things, these 3 issues, are a clever, a good mixture, let's say, compatible with neutrality. And supplying weapons, I think, is out of the question. So this mixture seems reasonable and seems a rational and good choice, not to escalate, but to also not be out of the scenario. So I think that's compatible with neutrality, and Switzerland and Austria act here, I think, in a very reasonable, also sensible way.
And maybe Heinz, do you see parallels? I mean, the parallel that I meant also was how, in my view, Ukrainian neutrality was torpedoed mainly by Western powers, not by Russia, which actually demanded it, which actually wanted Ukrainian neutrality. Do you see parallels with 1955 Germany?
I saw parallels already. I published a piece in an Austrian paper on March 3, where I said, in order to avoid war in Ukraine, Ukraine should look at the Austrian model of neutrality. That March 3 was before the Russian invasion in Crimea. So my consequence at that time, already March 3, was either we will have a war or we will have a divided Ukraine like Germany. So now it turns out it's like more divided Ukraine like Korea, but my prediction was division, permanent division or permanent neutrality. That was my suggestion for Ukraine. It didn't work out. We cannot discuss it at length here. Of course, in March 22, there was still on the table in Istanbul neutrality. For several reasons, it was abandoned. Second was what Michael said. Of course, neutrality always comes in different shapes and forms in history, and now the global south is emerging and has more or less non-aligned neutral positions. And quantitatively in Europe, it's true we have less neutrals, but that doesn't mean that neutrality would lose quality. I would say the opposite is true now. The remaining neutrals have additional tasks, and Austria, together, of course, with Ireland and Malta and Cyprus, but they have the important task to build a bridge between the European Union and the global south. Because Austria, for example, has the same, and the other states as well, the same position, the same philosophy like most of the countries in the global south east. They are non-aligned and they are nuclear weapon free. And in terms of nuclear weapon free zones, Austria has a tradition. Austria played an important role to set up the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. So Austria would have comparative advantages here. So, and I just want to mention another analogy. During the Cold War, when the neutral and non-aligned were very active in setting up the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, the CSE process, without the neutral and non-aligned, that wouldn't have happened. Yugoslavia played this role. Yugoslavia played a very active role in the CSE process, but also a leading role in the non-aligned movement in the third world at that time. So Austria would have a responsibility to pick up this, to seize this opportunity. But after the end of some years after the end of the war in Ukraine, we will have to have another CSE process that will be necessary. That neutral and non-aligned also from the global south would start such a debate. But of course, the summit will not be Helsinki anymore because Helsinki will be part of NATO, but maybe Vienna or some capital from the global south.
Right.
Let me add one thing, and I fully agree with Heinz, with his interpretation, also with his hope towards Switzerland and Austria as maybe hopefully future mediators also. The difference to Germany in the 50s and now, I think if we can refer to that famous quotation by Lord Ismay, what is the purpose of NATO? He said internally, to keep the Russians out, to keep us, the West, the Americans in, and to keep the Germans down. The big difference is Germany now should not be to be kept down. No, they actually need a stronger Germany, much more involved in that Ukrainian war, more indirectly than directly. But the first two goals still are valid. So to keep the Russians out and to keep us, the Americans, the Brits, the West in. And in the consequence, in the end, this would mean a German solution for Ukraine. The division of Ukraine and let's say a kind of a new Iron Curtain, much more going to east, not from Stettin to Trieste, but from Finland up to the Black Sea. And this would be, I think, for Europe, from a point of view of European policy of responsibility, a very bad solution, a worst case solution. And I will come back also to George F. Kennan, a wise man. Heinz mentioned him before. He said very early, when the first NATO enlargement started in 1999 with Poland, with Hungary and the Czech Republic, this NATO Eastern enlargement would be the continuation of a new Cold War. And what we have now is a new Cold War, I think, since the late 1990s, plus a hot regional war in the center of Europe. And this cannot be in the interest from a European point of view, from an EU point of view. And that's why I think there's a strong need for also neutrals in Europe, the rest of the neutrals, the hope for that. The other way would mean that Chinese, Americans, Russians, or Turkey would negotiate, would mediate, and this also cannot be in the interest of a, let's say, policy of European responsibility for Europe. So there's a big danger that the European Union will lose its position of a regional power in Europe itself. So it's a worst case scenario. And my hope is also that neutrals will remain and will be engaged. But this would mean, in the case of Austria, to reactivate her neutrality. That's the precondition in order then to engage or to have an engaged neutrality.
Which is a concept that you have been championing for a long time, Heinz, isn't it?
Yeah, that's true. We have to, neutrality is coming with very different shapes, as I said. So over history, neutrality has taken different forms and has been very flexible. And of course, in the 19th century, we had only neutrality, the occasional neutrality, keep staying out of war. But then there was also for a time the Pascal, you know this better than I do, this isolationist integral neutrality. But then we moved on. Austria had the concept of active neutrality in the 70s, but we are not in the 70s anymore. And now engaged neutrality means that Austria is part of the European security defense policy and also part of the Partnership for Peace. But also neutrality is not a neutrality when it comes to values. Neutrals should raise their voice if it comes to massive human rights violations, to genocide, ethnic cleansing, and war. But at the same time, engaged neutrality means that neutral states have to offer something. They have to make proposals, to set initiatives. Otherwise, it would be this would only be confessions against human rights violations. So we have to suggest something. And now we are back, basically, as Michael said, we are in a situation like in the 50s with the Cold War and the new Iron Curtain, Cordon Sanitaire. So we have to move on to the 70s, to the CSE process. And then neutral and non-aligned states, I include the Global South, have to start initiatives. The Helsinki or the CSE process began at 71, so a couple of years before the Helsinki summit took place. So now neutral and non-aligned states, together with states from the Global South, would have to start a new process in order to avoid that we go through to the whole situation in the 50s and in the 60s, coming to the 70s. We were lucky if we could do this, but the Americans would say America is an indispensable nation, Madeleine Albright. I would say the neutrals in this is indispensable states.
My problem that I have is that I see that the neutrals of Europe, Austria, Switzerland included, Ireland too, are so incredibly weak when it comes to dissociate themselves from what's currently being pushed in the West, that they're fully completely integrated. I mean, the Western neutrals, Switzerland, Austria, were very quick to follow the condemnation of Russia after in February 2022 immediately, and said this is against international law and everything. And right now, as we speak, I hear no condemnation of the ongoing genocide right now in Gaza. I mean, 5,000 people are dead already, and there's nothing. I mean, the West kind of made its narrative, and our countries are always on board with what's currently coming from Washington. At least that's what it seems to me. And I know that colleagues from the Global South also see it like that. I know this is a very, very controversial and contemporary thing, but Michael, do you think that the European neutrals still have some power in themselves not to go along with every new narrative that comes from Berlin, Brussels, and Washington?
Well, I think they have no real strong power. But if you take the other EU and NATO member states, and if you look to the attempts to get a solution within the Minsk I and Minsk II negotiations, the so-called Normandy format, when Germany, France, Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine negotiated that. In the end, it failed because I think there was also no strong hard power by the Germans at that time to put more pressure on the Ukraine and on Russia. Also France, it's an atomic power, but had not such a strong hard power on a conventionally military base. So in the end, this failed. And because it was also not in the American interest that the Europeans under themselves would negotiate this issue with Ukraine and Russia. So the problem of a lacking of hard power is not only a problem of Austria and Switzerland, but they have soft power. And they have one thing what is important: both Austria and Switzerland, not Ireland, are states with seats of international organizations. So United Nations, the OSCE, the OPEC, the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, and these international organizations bring countries, states together, which are also opponents and rivals. This is one thing, I think, which is very important, to keep this position as mediators with international seats. So neutrality is not only useful for Switzerland and Austria itself, but also useful for the world of states. And I think this is still important. And if you take the Cold War, the new Cold War, which I argue since 1999, with a hot regional war in Europe, much more dangerous than the old Cold War. I think this old Cold War was more controlled, more risk limited between the USSR and the US. The new Cold War has much more incalculable and unpredictable concerning the outcome. That's why the neutrals, I think, are a better way to negotiate via Geneva, via Vienna, then in the end, Beijing and Moscow and Washington will negotiate the ending of the Ukrainian war without the Europeans, without the neutrals. But there's still an important point, what Heinz said, Helsinki 2.0 will not happen. And also Stockholm will not be the place when Sweden will join NATO. So the neutrals have room of maneuver. They have to be more initiative. They have to be more active, more engaged. And let's add a further point. Also, we have this NATO Partnership for Peace, PFP. Concerning Austria and concerning Switzerland, I think this PFP construct is a useful, a practical, and also a pragmatic way to be to a certain way in and not totally on the sidelines. But important not to be involved in that war. So, and if you take Kosovo 1999, if you take Iraq 2003, what happened? What happened? They stopped negotiations. They, would mean NATO, intervened in the case of Kosovo. And this was not a long-term solution, as we see now. So negotiations would be better. In the case of Iraq, weapons inspections by Hans Blix and by Mohammed El-Baradei would have been better than to intervene militarily. So in the long view, you see, to keep neutrals out was not the best solution concerning Kosovo and concerning Iraq. And my last point, you mentioned the actual situation, the confrontation, the conflict, let's say the war between Palestine and Israel. I think with regard to terrorism, we should not forget that neutrals can serve as a kind of protection shield also against terrorism. There's a kind of respect by the terrorists towards the issue of neutrality. So this would keep Switzerland and Austria also a bit more safer than Germany or countries. They are so much, let's say, one-sided positioned in that conflict. And if you ask me for a kind of hope for a future solution concerning a two-state solution for both sides, we need also neutrals to negotiate and to mediate. The US are not in that position, and also Germany not, also due to the historical responsibility that Germany has. So we need mediators, not only for being protected against terrorism, we need mediators, and that's why I would underline the position pointed out by Heinz, that neutrals are necessary.
Heinz, the last 2 minutes go to you, because there are people who would rather see Austria join NATO. You know, one more member is better, a 33rd member, rather than a neutral Austria. Do you understand what the logic behind that is, and do you see the value in Austrian neutrality still today?
No, if Austria gave up its neutrality, it would immediately join NATO like Finland and Sweden and lose all this potentials of neutral states as mediators, providing good services, engage neutrality, that will all be gone. But Austria, being neutral, still missed many opportunities. And also after in 2014, when the model of Austria for Ukraine was on the table, the Austrian foreign ministry picked it up for a couple of months and dropped it in October 2014 for several reasons, which I don't want to talk about. Second point, you don't need necessarily too much hard power. Of course, neutrals have to be armed. That's important to have the credible, neutrality has to be credible politically, but also militarily. Armed neutrality is possible. But you don't need a too strong military in order to play a political role. We see this, Qatar is a small military power, but is playing a huge mediation role as interlocutor when it comes to Afghanistan, even the Ukraine war, Iran, Saudi Arabia, now Hamas and US. And so you don't need necessarily hard power. And last point, but the war now going on in the Middle East, Austria has a strong tradition in good suggestions, and Austria was a small neutral state, and with Bruno Kreisky, Austria could make good proposals, and Austria was the first statesman to bring the idea of the two-state solutions before the United Nations. So that was basically an Austrian idea, but Austria dropped it, and now I guess to some extent these tensions could have been avoided if Austria had followed up with this tradition. And we have these Abraham Accords between Israel and the Arab states, and Saudi Arabia was about to join, sidelining the Palestinians, entirely sidelining the Palestinians, leading this for any time future, some solution. Austria could have said, we follow up the Kreisky tradition and say, first the Palestinian situation resolved, going back to the 67 borders, and then the Abraham Accords between Israel and the Arab states. So that would have turned the situation around and not sidelined the Palestinians. That's the problem we have here now because of the war. So Austria missed many opportunities. So that's what I'm saying, but in the future it could seize opportunities coming up.
Let me just very briefly add one point concerning CSCE from a historical point of view. The non-aligned and neutral states were not only supporting the process of the CSCE, also they helped to prevent the breakdown of the CSCE follow-up conferences in 1983, when we had these meetings in Madrid due to the so-called Second Cold War. And if you look to new research outcomes concerning the third CSCE follow-up conference in Vienna, taking place from 1986 to 1989, you can see with historical archival evidence that especially the neutrals with non-papers bridged the gap between the hardliners of the Eastern camp, so Romania and especially the GDR, and they in the end could achieve solving the tensions between the GDR delegation and the West German delegation in Vienna in order to get visa-free solutions, to get the more improved and strengthened the human dimension of the CSCE process. As we can show that the Austrians, the Swiss, the Swedes helped to bridge the gap between the different positions between GDR and FRG delegations in Vienna, and contributed to, in the end, to the solution of the German question. And this was, as we well know, the key problem of the Cold War, the division of Germany. The German Cold War was part of the European and the world Cold War. And I think this historical evidence should be, let's say, a motivation, a stimulation that with a more engaged and active mediation policy and neutrality policy, Switzerland and Austria can contribute for a better solution in future Europe.
I couldn't say it better. And with these words, happy Neutrality Day, my Austrian friends, and we'll talk again next time.
Okay, yes, thank you, Pascal. Thank you.